Call to order the Ordinance Committee meeting of October 19th, 2010 of the City of Santa Barbara. Ms. Peterson, will you please call a roll?
Chair Bendy White.
Here.
Frank Hotchkiss.
Here.
Grant House.
Here.
All right. Well, Ms. Peterson, will you please read what is on our agenda today?
Sure. There are two items before you today. The first one is amendments and additions to the adopted building codes, and the second item will be the 2010 Fire Code adoption.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, before we get started,
Vincent?
each of the committee members has been handed revised copies of the two ordinances. One copy is a revised copy of the Fire Code, the ordinance, and the other is for the Building Codes ordinance. The Fire Codes ordinance is a revision to show the changes that are being proposed in this iteration to the current municipal code. And we can do that with the fire code because the current language in the municipal code are the local amendments to the international fire code. Where this iteration is the state has now adopted the updated international fire code, and we're making revisions off of that this time around. So it makes sense to compare the proposed revisions this time around to what's actually in the municipal code. Turning to the building codes ordinance, the revised building codes ordinance that you have before you, that revised ordinance has an addition to it that was actually an oversight on our part. There was an omission in the one that was handed to you or presented to you in your packets. And so we've included that omission. And that is in the residential code section dealing with residential sprinkler requirements. And so you'll see that language included in the revised version that you have today. Just so that you don't get confused when you see the changes in these various ordinances. The building codes ordinance, that shows changes in the case where the city is amending the building code sections that have been adopted by the state. There are plenty of sections, and you'll see in their titles, where building code sections that have been adopted by the state are deleted in their entirety by the city and then readopted to read differently as the city wants. We haven't showed those changes because with our showing changes format, that would just be a big underlined paragraph, and it wouldn't tell you anything more than it would as a clean paragraph. So there's just a formatting issue here. Mr. Estrella will be able to explain in better detail if there are changes from the current municipal code, the current local revisions to these building code ordinances, in making that comparison from the current municipal code to what's being proposed this time around. So that's an explanation of the two revised codes that were presented to you today.
Okay, very good. Mr. Hotchkiss?
Do I understand correctly that every town, city, county in the state has to adopt these or not?
I'm sure Mr. Estrella is going to cover that, but I'll give you the start off, and he'll go into more detail. The state adopts the California Building Code and other ancillary codes as part of its process. The cities, if the cities do not adopt their own local amendments as we are doing in this process, the cities then are basically the California Building Code as adopted by the state becomes that local jurisdiction's building code. And it applies for the residential code as well. So what we're doing here, the state has already adopted their codes. There's a window period for the staff to review those codes and determine whether local amendments are necessary. If staff makes certain findings, and ultimately the council makes certain findings regarding topography, climate, or geography, that based on those findings, we can make our own local amendments. And those local amendments are what are being proposed to you and presented to you today.
Additionally, though, you can only make amendments that are more stringent, not less, than the state code. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll open with the building code amendments, and we have a presentation from staff.
Chair White, members of the Ordinance Committee, my name is George Estrella. I'm the Chief Billing Official. We do have the building codes up front, followed by the fire codes, but because some of the fire codes amendments are recommended by the Fire Marshal, Mr. Joe Pori, to my right, we have him up here to be able to answer any questions that you might have during the course of the presentation. First, I'd like to take a few minutes, real briefly, to give you a little bit of the background of codes so we can have a good basic understanding of how they evolve, how they come about, and how we ultimately enforce these codes at the local jurisdiction. Interesting to note, years ago, we had a building code that dated back to 1760 was the first known building code, 1760 BC, known as the Hammurabi building code. It was very simplistic in nature. It was basically an eye for an eye or tooth for a tooth. And so back in these days, they had a standard code that basically said if a builder builds a house for someone and does not construct it properly, and the house which he builds falls and kills its owner, and then the builder shall be put to death. And if the owner's son dies, then the builder's son shall be put to death. Very stringent building code, and those buildings, as you probably can imagine, lasted for several thousands of years. Well, we've come a long way in the building code development process from the time of Hammurabi. Today we have an organization called the International Code Council. This is truly an international organization, otherwise known as ICC. The ICC holds the code development hearings throughout the United States, and we're on a 3-year cycle. Currently, we're looking at the 2010 building codes. The previous building codes, one that we're currently on, is the 2007 building codes. So effective January 1 of 2011, we will be enforcing the state codes. The ICC, as I said, does hold hearings throughout the United States to gather input, information, provisions from a wide range of interested parties, from builders to professionals, to fire officials, to building officials, to product industry people, all vying for code provisions, hopefully with the thought that the codes being proposed achieve something viable, such as buildings being safe, is the bottom line. For the state of California, we do have a code body, and that's called the Building Standards Commission, which is also on a 3-year cycle. The Building Standards Commission for the state of California is comprised of approximately 9 members who hear code proposals from approximately, 18 state agencies. So we have 18 state agencies that propose new code or revisions to the state codes. And there's the process that goes through, and when opportunity is given, fire officials, building officials, and all interested parties can attend the Building Standards Commission to support, not support, recommend changes at that level. That is where the code process takes place for the state of California, and it's a 3-year process. After the 3-year process, the Building Standards Commission publishes the codes, typically in July. In this case, it was July 4th of 2010, in which they give jurisdictions 180 days, 6 months, in which to bring forth amendments. As our attorney, Mr. Vincent, has said, if no proposed amendments are made or adopted by a local entity, the state-mandated codes become enforceable. That means you take what the state gives you, and you have no say-so at that point. So what we're proposing today are a variety of code amendments that many of them have been intact for years. We do have new codes that are being proposed. As a couple of weeks ago, you heard an update regarding the California Green Code. That's one of the new codes that will be implemented also in January 1. And I have to tell you, in all honesty, we're still scratching our head on how we're going to enforce some of those provisions because they're very gray in nature. We have a new residential building code. And as Mr. Vincent had said, under our normal building ordinance provisions, that was a blanket building code, it did incorporate provisions for the residential portion. What the state of California did is pluck out the residential provisions of the standard building code and created a separate code called the residential building code. Some of the provisions that we had in the building ordinance were pulled out, such as the residential sprinkler portion, and placed in the new residential building code. So we want to emphasize that and clarify that also. So once the amendments are brought forward to you and ultimately City Council for consideration and hopefully approval, those amendments and the ordinance, adopting ordinance, are forwarded to the Building Standards Commission for filing and record. We're mandated by the state to file our amendments with the Building Standards Commission. And very clear, these amendments are specific to the city of Santa Barbara. And it is due to climatic, topographical, and geological conditions. And those provisions are also noted in the ordinance themselves. Finally, I do want to say is I want to speak a little bit about the enforcement of the codes. This is very important to understand that we are mandated by the state of California to enforce the Title 24 California Codes and Regulations. And you have a variety of state agencies who assume jurisdiction. Probably the number one agency that assumes most of the jurisdiction for the enforcement of the building standard code provisions is the state fire marshal. So the state fire marshal really covers a broad range of buildings and life safety provisions in which those provisions are charged to the local entity, be it city or county, to implement and enforce those provisions. In this case, you have your fire chief and fire marshal who enforce provisions, as well as the chief building official, myself, who administer the codes. So through the administering of the codes, the bottom line is what is it that we're trying to achieve? What is the purpose of the codes? Well, in simply put, the purpose of the codes is just to provide minimum code standards to protect the public and the health and the well-being of the public, their living conditions, where they live at home, where they go to work, where we shop, this building that we are in today. And again, knowing that every 3 years the codes change. And so provided a building element is deemed safe, it is considered grandfathered in, it's considered existing non-conforming. But as new codes become adopted, any alteration to an existing building as well as new buildings that are being constructed, must comply with the current provision of the codes. So something that the Ordinance Committee and Council ultimately should be aware of is that currently we have projects that are going through the process. The time clock starts when the application for a project is submitted formally to the building division for formal plan check. So projects that are submitted prior to January 1 are permitted to be constructed under the current Title 24 California Codes of Regulations, the 2007 code. Applications received on or after January 1st must comply with the 2000 California Code provisions. So sometimes there's a little mix-up in there, and sometimes architects and engineers are trying to get projects in, and we get a little overwhelmed at some point in time. But ultimately, you may be going through a discretionary review process, but yet you may have to revise a project that you're going through the discretionary process once you formally submit, because it may actually be after January 1. Again, with that, I just want to reemphasize that these are state-mandated codes that we are charged to enforce. We do have control over some amendments, but for the most part, the black and white letter of their codes are enforced as delegated the responsibility to us from the State Fire Marshal's office and other governing state departments. So with that, I will move ahead and kind of just briefly talk about the building code ordinance, and of course will be available for questions afterwards. You have what appears to be numerous amendments, and in reality, these amendments really have transpired or been on the books and codified for many years. Some of the significant changes in the past, I'll just bring your attention to, had to do with the grading ordinance, in which is a large section in which really the California Code of Regulations, as it applies to grading, was very limited in scope. The recommendation for this, of course, is that we have some higher provisions that are suitable for Santa Barbara. We have the Riviera, we have the Mesa, we have areas that are quite hilly with a variety of types of soils, and these grading provisions hopefully address each case that potentially come up. Now, I have to tell you, there's more information in the grading ordinance than we can shake a stick at, but it's there just in case something comes up. And so depending on where a project may be built, you don't get the whole ordinance thrown at you, so to speak. You just get those code provisions. And real quickly, what is the purpose of the grading ordinance? It regulates the way a site is addressed. It's protected. It has to do with setbacks and distances from a hill to a structure. In case a hill should and hopefully not collapse, hopefully there's enough distance between a hill and a structure. There's retaining walls. There's draining issues that are incorporated. It's a really comprehensive document that has worked for us over the past years. And again, we're just bringing this forward with no amendments. It's just, I just want to make sure that you understand that this is something that's been on the books for several years now. The next area that we probably have the most...
Can I ask you just a quick question?
Yes.
I thought you said these were new. Now you're saying it's been all these grading provisions are already on the books?
Yes. Let me clarify that. As we have existing code in place, that was under the previous 2007 code adoption in which we amended. So on ordinance, we already have these provisions in place. But as we move forward to adopt the new 2010 California Codes of Regulations, we're bringing those same amendments forward. So when I say that they've been on the books before, they were on the ordinance. But as with every 3-year cycle, we have to reintroduce the amendments and apply them. So it's something that's been enforced, but yet with the new codes, we have to implement the amendments.
Okay, so we do have some new ones as well as the old ones as well.
We do,
okay.
not in the grading ordinance, but yes, we do, and I'm going to address those. So really, for the most part, the building code ordinance, as you see it, is pretty much the same as the past code adoption cycle for the 2007 codes. What is new is the residential code, in which we have basically a lot of adjustments or amendments. And I do have to tell you, quite honestly, that we don't believe that the residential code was ready for prime time, so to speak. There was a lot of provisions, special inspections, administrative provisions that give us the tools to administrate residential construction. To clarify that is, in the building code itself, now again I have to tell you the state has separated the codes, in the building code provisions where the residential code was applicable before, when they pulled it out and created a second document called the residential code, they left provisions that should have been applicable to the residential code in the building code and didn't transfer it to the residential code. So what we're doing basically is a cleanup. It's more than anything else to properly administrate and make sure that buildings are being built, that we have the checks and balances, the special inspections, and the administrative provisions that we previously had that were just left out in the residential code. So while it looks like there's a lot of provisions there, those many code provisions in the residential, those amendments were existing under the existing building code. But they have to show as amendments. The next code that is new for us also is the property maintenance code, which I have here. I'm not sure, you probably do not have a copy. I would just give you a brief overview. This is called the International Property Maintenance Code. And what this is, it just provides the building department additional tools to use on properties or structures that might be substandard, abandoned, or in critical, unhealthy conditions. One of the things that we've been fighting for a long time, many years now, is we see commercial buildings that might be in a deteriorated state. And yet the codes and ordinances that we had at the time didn't really address commercial buildings. They did address residential buildings, including under the Health and Safety Code. So we believe with the International Property Maintenance Code, it gives us additional tools to look at commercial buildings, and if they're not painted or well kept or landscaped, in other words, they detract from the community or the neighborhoods, that we can initiate some corrective action and get them to also comply. So while we did have some codes that addressed that in the past, they were very kind of not so clear. And hopefully with the property maintenance code, we have a couple more tools to address those items. And finally, as 2 weeks ago or so, a few weeks ago, I gave you an update on the Cal Green Code. We're moving forward with the adoption of the Cal Green Code with no amendments at all. We're not proposing any amendments to the Cal Green Code. They will simply, as printed, as written, will become effective January 1, and we will, of course, enforce those provisions. With that, I'll conclude my comments, and I'm available for questions.
Are there questions of Mr. Shea? Mr. House?
I had a question on one of the exceptions that we find in here a couple of places, and I'm glad to see our fire marshal is here too, because I didn't quite understand it, and maybe you can help. One place where it showed up in the document that we have here is on appears to be on page 39 of the one that we were handed today, and it was ventilation requirements, and in particular was the exception to item 2 under R327.6.2. And it talks about vents located under the roof covering along the ridge of roofs with the exposed surface of the vent covered by non-combustible wire mesh may be of combustible materials. And I'd just like to understand that a little bit better, because I know that's a very likely point of entry for fire embers in our high fire areas, and we're very careful about that. And yet this maybe I'm reading it wrong. It seemed like this exception was kind of going in the wrong direction, but maybe Mr. Poirier can help us understand that better.
Chair White, members of the committee, as near as I know, the reason for this is that if the exterior of the vent is covered by non-combustible material, for the state of California purposes, it makes it acceptable as a reasonably fire resistive ventilation point. I agree with you, though. It does seem to indicate that it's going in the wrong direction. But the fire vents that the state of California allows now are limited to actually about 3 manufacturers, and they all must resist the intrusion of embers first. From the exterior, and you've probably heard of them. They're the typical double baffle type of ventilation system, where basically an ember would have to almost negotiate a kind of a maze to get inside of an attic or similar. Those can be covered with wire mesh. They can also be, but they're also non-combustible on the exterior. Of course, on the inside of any structure, especially a residential structure, it's going to be combustible in an attic space. Or in a rafter bay or anything else. It's usually going to be made out of wood.
So it's your feeling that this is sufficient for us to, because we do experience these kinds of fires, and the heat drafting and all that happens is pretty intense. And I guess that rose to my radar, kind of, went off there. And but you think that this is sufficient for us here locally to protect
I think that a reasonable degree of fire safety does exist with this configuration, yes.
Because and number 2, that it is the exception to, is just very clear. It says materials used shall be non-combustible, and it just leaves it stop right there. Could you just explain one more little piece, and maybe, or Mr. Estrella, why would we want to have an exception to that when the state code is pretty clear about it, and they just leave it flat that the materials should be non-combustible for the ventilation openings?
I think that what it does is allow for the construction of the home itself. In other words, a vent has to be mounted to something, and generally it's going to be mounted to the framing of the structure. And I think that what this does is it allows for the interior framing of the structure to be of a combustible substance, i.e. wood. And that's to answer your question, why would we have an exception like this? My only thought is that in the state's view, that it does allow for, if combustible construction from the structure itself is a part of that vent opening, in other words, enclosing it, or it's tacked to it, or whatever,
okay.
that is allowed.
Just going to the original rule that Mr. Hotchkiss asked about, that the local ordinance revisions or amendments can only be more strict than the state. This is the one out of the entire set of documents that you gave us in preparation, as I was reading, that it appeared that we were going the other way. This was actually us coming up with an exception that reduced the code requirement here locally. And maybe by the time we're done, our attorney can help us understand if we really have the privilege to do that here.
Well, now's the time.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, I think when we spoke earlier, the local amendments cannot be less restrictive, or less protective. And so basically you would need to make a finding that this is equivalently protective as to the standard rule. So you have the standard rule is the materials shall be non-combustible. The exception needs to be equivalently protective as that standard. And the explanation from Building and Safety is that the alternative design with the non-combustible wire mesh and its configuration of the vent is equally protective. I have to defer to the gentlemen who do this for a living as to whether or not that's the case.
Okay. When we have comments, I might comment on that one. That one is just of concern. And the other items that are in that, the addition of 4, 5, and 6, which really do make it more rigorous. The turbine attic vents shall be equipped to allow one-way direction rotation only, and shall not free spin in both directions. You can, here we've got our experiences here that really want us to have that more restrictive language. Anyway, that's my concern, and we can talk about it some more, but I'm worried a little bit about that one.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. House. Mr. Hotchkiss?
Hi, Mr. Poirier. 3 fire questions, if I could. Regarding sprinklers, didn't we recently pass an ordinance that allowed it for remodeling up to 75% of an existing building before the whole residence was required to be retrofitted with sprinklers?
We did, and those provisions are imported into the residential code.
Okay.
In fact, as that was going to be part of my comment, but I should address it now. The building code and the fire code are companion documents, the building code being the design document, fire code being the maintenance document. But there are sections that read identical. For instance, in the sprinkler sections for the building and fire code for commercial occupancies, they both fall under the 903 series of both codes. So if you look at 903 in the building code and 903 in the fire code, they both read the same language. It's identical. What happened when the state of California adopted the residential code was they separated the residential sprinkler requirements from the commercial requirements, and they put them in the residential code. So what we, in turn, had to do was we took our residential requirements and we simply took them out of the building code and the fire and the fire code, and we imported them into the residential code as adopted by the city of Santa Barbara. So those provisions are still there. And they fall under R313 in the adopting ordinance.
Okay, I just want to be sure they still applied because we worked on that together.
Correct.
Other fire question says smoking of any kind is proscribed in a wildland urban interface area. Where are those areas in Santa Barbara?
The wildland urban interface areas in Santa Barbara, there are actually 4 of them. There are 2 coastal zones, which we consider to be less hazardous fire areas, and there are 2 foothill zones. There's the foothill, what we call the foothill zone, which is a high fire hazard area, and then the extreme foothill zone. And the extreme foothill zone, and these are delineated on maps, the extreme foothill zone, as you can imagine, is the higher end of the Riviera, up in the Gibraltar area and so forth. And those 2 zones are the most extreme of the fire zones that we have.
But it says smoking of any kind is proscribed. People live up there.
I'm sorry, in what section are you quoting me? Because I
don't have the section. I just take the quote here. It says smoking of any kind is proscribed in a wildland urban interface area. Whatever the wildland urban interface area is, I don't think we're telling people don't have a cigar at night in your house, are we?
That's correct. We're not saying that, and that's why I was curious about the section that you were quoting, if it came from the fire code or the building code adoption.
I don't know. It was the stuff that I got before I got here today, so we hunt that down. But it does say that. Another fire question: what are our? Maybe you just answered it. What are our high fire hazard areas? Is that if we just gone through those?
Those were the extreme and the foothill and extreme foothill zones, the primary.
Okay, fine. Thank you. Mr. Stray, a couple of questions. Have we talked at all with our local contractors regarding these new suggested additions?
That's a really good question. Over the years, we have talked with them. We have met. And in fact, most recently, we have provided some code training on the new codes. Again, when I say the new codes, primarily the residential code and also the green code, etc. So yes, we have provided training. Again, as many of the amendments that you see have already been on the book, so to speak, so it's not anything new. We will continue providing training to our architects, engineers, and contractors. So yes, they're aware of the provisions. As a matter of fact, I believe it's not next week, the following week, we'll have some more code training opportunities for our contractors.
All right, different question. Thank you. At one point, it addresses page 3 of what we were originally given, section 105.2, and under building, it says residential fences and walls not over 3.5 feet in height are exceptions. Don't need. So, but in our codes, as I understand it, on a side or back fence, you can have a 6-foot fence, but it doesn't mention it here. How do we do that now? Are we changing that?
No, actually, let's start with the exception. The exception says anything less than 3.5 feet basically does not require a permit. Now, why is that? We've got to ask the question, why is that the case? If it's something over 3.5 feet, it does require a permit, which regulates various heights. So the first answer to the question probably has to do with public safety. Many homes have garages and driveways that exit the front. And so to have a 6-foot fence there or a higher fence might be a safety issue. Plus, it's probably an aesthetic issue. And an aesthetic issue, I have to go back to what the zoning ordinance requires. So while we're saying that a building permit is triggered at 3.5 feet, actually our zoning code kicks in and regulates the size and height of fences. I understand from our zoning ordinance that on your side yards and rear yards, depending on circumstances, you may actually have a fence that could reach 8 feet in height.
Okay, thank you. This also seems stringent to me, and I don't have the section here, but it sort of said anything that requires new piping of any sort, new valves, et cetera, goes on, would require a permit. And I'm thinking about when my pipe breaks under my sink and I have to put in a new pipe under there. I don't think if I have to go to the city, I'm not going to do it, frankly, and I don't think anybody is. So how do we get around that here?
Well, it's not a matter of getting around anything. This is what the state of California mandates. Let me clarify that. The code does provide maintenance of plumbing fixtures. If you're talking about water piping, if you're talking about leaky pipes, you are allowed to maintenance that. What is gray is what is it that you're doing to maintenance that? In other words, if you're maybe brazing a pipe to seal up a leak, a permit's not going to be required. But if you're changing out a pipe, for example, it doesn't specify what the size of the pipe is or length of the pipe, technically speaking, a permit's going to be required. Why is that the case? Well, because many homes in Santa Barbara, you probably have galvanized water piping. And homeowners who may not be aware with codes may use copper, other dissimilar metals. They may think they're fixing something, and what you have as a result is leaky pipes again. So a simple mixing of dissimilar metals is something that we take a look at. There's transition fittings, and that's just a simple fix of a pipe. And, of course, we can use the same thing with why do we require permits for changing out water heaters or sinks, and it's the same reason. Sometimes, unfortunately, many of our homeowners, they're well-intended, but they may not have the experience to do something exactly right, and they end up getting themselves in troubles. Simple sink replacements, for example, where the trap configuration and the trap weir doesn't match up. What happens when you improperly install a sink with an improper trap? You lose your trap seal, and what happens is you get methane gas coming back into your home, and that's unhealthy. So seemingly the codes are to protect the health and welfare of the public and the residents, and sometimes they're stringent, and sometimes we may not agree with them. But what we do is, hopefully, as you will know and council will know, is we do try to enforce them fairly with common sense and uniformly.
Okay, so let me just continue along that lines. If I do have a pipe problem and hire a plumber and he comes over and says, oh, we got to do this and this, and it's going to cost X, is he then going to say, plus you got to pay for a permit? And if so, what's the cost going to be?
Well, that really is up to the how the plumbing contractor works. Again, is it a simple fix? Is it a maintenance fix? He is a licensed plumber, and he's bound by state laws, the contracting laws, as when it may trigger a building permit. Whether he incorporates the permit into his initial fee, or he does it afterwards, that's really between the homeowner and the hired plumber.
But what's the cost going to be? What's the building permit?
It all depends on what the type of work is. Probably the minimum amount of work that could be issued might be maybe $132 worth of a simple permit. It really depends on what the work is, and that's about 30 minutes worth of inspection. And again, $100 sounds like a lot of money, but if an inspector goes out there and catches the fact that you have dissimilar metals, you have a water heater that's not connected properly to its vent, there's a lot of things that can go wrong on a simple replacement. That's why we're there.
So is the zoning report going to be a great deal more detailed as a result of these requirements?
Well, let's start off with the zoning report. The zoning report is more geared towards zoning, compliance with zoning regulations, and they're not really experts in building, although they may detect some violations or alterations, and if they do, they check the existing archive records. If they detect something that may not be right, they do bring it forward. They're usually looking for major things, items that are really noteworthy. I think if somebody saw I probably don't even want to say, but I would just say they're not there to nitpick you on the zoning, but they're there to make sure that the structure itself complies with zoning regulations, and they see some obvious work that had been done that appears to be in violation of the codes or does not match significantly the previously approved plans. Then we take a little closer look into it.
So when is something like this going to be caught if, rightly or wrongly, somebody says, forget the building permit, just do it, and they do it correctly? When is that liable to be caught by the city?
Well, you're asking some really good questions here.
Well, I'm asking the homeowner. I think that's
yeah.
what people
Well,
think.
let me put it this way. We don't stand at the door of Home Depot and watch every person go in and out and say you have to obtain a permit, But, if a bona fide licensed plumber is doing some significant works, he's probably want to cover himself both legally and with the state by obtaining a permit. Obviously, there's a lot of work that takes place in the city of Santa Barbara without building permits, from small maintenance to large additions and beyond, and we see the whole gamut of it. So it's kind of hard to answer. If we see something obvious, we will address it.
I'm just afraid we're opening a can of worms that's going to make both your inspectors and the homeowners.
Well, we've been doing this actually for years, and the building codes has been that way. And it kind of depends. As I went back and as I previously said, we try to enforce the codes reasonably. And we're not there to nitpick. But I tell you what, if it's a life safety code provisions, we're going to be there and be nitpicky. If it's something kind of minor.
Roof gutters must be now provided with the means to prevent the accumulation of leaves and debris in the gutter. Does that mean we're going to have a whole different kind of roof gutter sold here, or is there some special installation that goes over your roof gutter?
Actually, the roof gutter provisions are pretty straightforward. The reason why you have roof gutter to begin with is to direct the water to certain locations. The problem that happens is if your drains are clogged up, they overflow, and actually they may back up, and if you, of course, have wood sheeting and other types of absorbent materials on your roof, it can start to eat and deteriorate the roof. So that's why you have the provisions there, and it's hopefully to try to keep the drains from backing up and damaging other parts of the buildings or the site. And again, the whole purpose is to channel the rainwater to areas that are designed
Right. Well, like now that's usually done with maintenance, a ladder and a gardener and yourself. Mm-hmm. So again, does this require a new kind of roof gutter be installed in the future for new construction?
Yes, it does to a certain extent, and it does require maintenance. And it's just a word. It's just good common sense to clean your gutters out.
Well, from the way it sounds, it doesn't require maintenance. The whole point of it is to keep the leaves out.
I'm saying it makes good sense to clean your gutters.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are the proposed or as stated restrictions on pools, spas, et cetera, are those existing or new?
Those are existing. Those are a carryover from our previous ordinance.
Under grading, one thing, a sentence struck me. It said, and I quote, "A person shall not own, use, occupy, or maintain any site containing unpermitted grading." That struck me as a sort of extreme police power, if I can put it that way. If somebody bought something and 20 years ago it wasn't caught prior to their ownership but did illegal grading, at least by this sentence, they could be subject to ejection. I don't think that's what we want, but.
Well, the whole premise of having the grading ordinance and this particular section is to encourage and promote the fact that there's various light amounts of grading. It's usually 50 cubic yards or less in which you can grade. But if you're going to do major grading and you leave it on your lot, it creates other erosion problems. It might affect adjacent neighbors. There's a whole host of problems that could come up by somebody grading their lot and leaving large piles or accumulation of earth. It's just not that we're going after the homeowner, but we're also looking at the adjacent property owners that it may impact.
Well, again, I mean, I understand that, but let's say that you bought a property, that can be 100 years old here, and that property was at one point, something on it was graded without proper permits. At least as this reads, somebody could come in and say, you're living, using, dwelling, maintaining, or whatever, property that contains unpermitted grading, here's a red slip.
Right. You know, I'm going to have to go back to say we have to have a common sense approach on how we enforce. Not only this item, but there's many items that we deal with on a day-to-day basis that, quite honestly, if you're talking about 100 years ago, I'm not sure we're going to know if you did some grading or not, unless it was drastically apparent and it's an obvious known violation, in which that case is there's no grandfathering for a violation of our building or city ordinances. So technically speaking, you could go back. But, you know, we have to use common sense in how we approach each and every situation that's probably different.
Is that appealable, by the way? That determination, if there's a difference of opinion between yourselves and a landowner?
Under the code provisions, and in you see in your code document, anybody can appeal the decision of building official to the Fire and Appeals Board.
So that's where it stops, at the Fire and Appeals Board?
They would have the final say-so.
Thank you. Finally, one thing, we talk about sensitive habitat. Do we have a definition of that? Or is there a federal or state definition? Because it says you can't do certain things in a sensitive habitat.
Yeah, I don't have the definition of it as contained in the building code. There may be other provisions with other departments or ordinances, so I
It's a little open-ended. I'm wondering
it really
why they
is.
in there.
It really is.
Mr. Vinson?
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, one of the places that is a sensitive habitat is defined is in the Endangered Species Act. And so that's one location of a sensitive habitat definition. That would be one place it would come up. Another would be the coastal zone. The Coastal Act has its own definitions of sensitive habitats as well.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks very much.
All right.
Mr. Chair, before we move on to the fire code for just 1 second, I do want to remind the members of the committee, this goes back to one of Mr. Estrella's initial statements, and is that these are, in general, what's been proposed here are local amendments to the state-adopted codes. If we don't make these local amendments, we get the state code as adopted by the state. So in the case of Councilmember Hotchkiss's questions regarding the plumbing code, we make our local amendments. We make those amendments that we choose to make or not make. But ultimately, the need for a plumbing permit to do work when it's required, that's going to exist whether we make our local amendments or not. And so while we may agree or not agree with how stringent the plumbing code is drafted, a plumbing permit is going to be required if the code requires it. And so some of the examples you were giving as far as homeowners getting tripped up by having to do maintenance projects and those kinds of things, our local amendments don't have any bearing on whether or not whether there's a trigger there or not.
Yeah, it's just not clear to me what our local amendments are, because we just got this document here, and what the state ones were, what the real difference is between the two.
Right. Okay. Well, we actually got the underlined version of the building code in our packet. So that one you did get the amendments on. The fire one, we did not get the underlined amendments, which we're moving on to now. So, okay. So let's move on to the fire
With
code.
the Chair's permission, may I address a couple of questions that did come up, and I'd like to go back and revisit for a moment. First on Committee Member Hotchkiss's question, the question you had about smoking actually comes from the Fire Code adopting ordinance under the Wildland-Urban Interface section. And it is section 4909.1, 4909.2, and it does prohibit smoking in wildland areas, but it specifically, there's an exception underneath it, specifically excludes any area that's habitable, for instance, a home, or any area where there's a designated campsite, any area that's designated smoking, those kinds of things. So you can have a barbecue, you can smoke in your home, and so forth.
Thank you.
But for instance, if you were walking through Palmer Park, that would be a no smoking area.
Got it. Thank you.
And if I could also address Committee Member House on the section that you were referring to in the building code, correction in the residential code, that was R327.6.2. It appears the way the adopting ordinance was written for the building code, and crunched a lot of sections here, and I can't remember exactly the history of the conversation we had at the time that we accepted this. But it appears that this is a changed section on the part of the City of Santa Barbara, and in fact it's not. Verbatim, it's the way the state adopted the code. So although we didn't make it more stringent, we didn't change it to make it less stringent than the state. That is the way the state language and the way the state has written it.
Okay, so I misinterpreted the underline. So the underline was the new state exception. It wasn't the city's changed language from the state's language.
Correct. It's the state language.
Okay, and I might actually just return it back to you again, though. Do we agree with an exception to combustibility of the material just inside of a vent that has non-combustible material as a grate on the outside? Again, and you're the one that taught me this at a variety of meetings where we talked about closing off those vents and really doing everything we could to prohibit the supercharged hot air and all the rest from getting inside of a, we really wanted to seal that exterior to the degree we could, and that's why I'm, as a good student, raising the question of my teacher.
Exactly. I think that's an excellent exception to reconsider, because that is something, since it is a state-adopted exception, it's something that we can make more stringent. What I would suggest is that we go back with our building department counterparts, since it is technically a building code, and we try to revisit exactly why we allowed that one to go through, or if it's an oversight.
Very good. I would really appreciate that.
Where we can change it.
Thank you so much.
Okay, well, why don't we sort of finish up the building code then at this point, and then we'll move on to the fire code. Mr. Estrella?
I can just have some concluding comments. As Joe said, we do have companion documents. They interact. I do want to let the Ordinance Committee know that our fire marshal and building official, we have a very cooperative effort in enforcing and administering the codes for the city. We try to be reasonable. Having said that, we do have new codes that are coming up. The 2010 codes are new, with 3 new codes, as I previously mentioned: the Green Code, the Property Maintenance Code, and the Residential Code. And so, as we move forward with the enforcement of the codes, while I don't know right now, and as I said, some of the enforcement and application is kind of nebulous, we might in fact have to come back to the Ordinance Committee and ultimately the Council to make some revisions so that we can make sense on some of the applications of the code and the enforcement of the code. So we did the best we could to date. It's a matter of moving forward and implementing them and flushing things out that may not make sense, and we may just have to come back at a later date to incorporate some changes or amendments.
Thank you, Mr. Estrella. Mr. House?
Well, are we expecting to get? Are we going to get?
Your mic is not on, is it?
Are we going to get more information in on the fire code right now, or are we? Did you have a presentation for us?
I have a little bit of information. A lot of my information is very similar in background. Just a couple of specifics that I'd like to cover.
Well, then let's do what was recommended by our chair, and we can settle on the building codes, perhaps.
First,
right
let's see whether there's. I see Ms. Red in the background. I don't know whether anybody wants to speak on this, but no. Okay. So now I'm opening the public comment portion of this and closing it. So now.
So you're asking for us perhaps to take action on the first part of our agenda today?
Is that how does staff okay with that? We deal with the building first and then move on to fire?
Yes, I would recommend that you would take action in that and then hear the fire code. And
very good. All right, so it's back to the
and I just
committee.
I want to thank Mr. Hotchkiss for the range of questions he was asking. We take so much of this for granted, and those of us who have been with, like, in the Planning Commission world, and hearing all this stuff over and again, it's really good to revisit some of this stuff and ask those very straightforward questions. I appreciate that, Mr. Hotchkiss. Thank you. I move that we recommend to the City Council introduction and a subsequent adoption of the Building Codes Ordinance.
Second.
Motion and a second to recommend approval of the building code changes. Now, we do have the vent question, however.
Oh, and I suppose then I was leaving that. The recommendation from our staff is that they take that back and perhaps come back to us with that particular one at some point if there were to be a revision. We'll include that as part of the motion. That item, the exception to item 2 of R327.6.2 requirements in the residential building code be reviewed by our staff for possible exemption. What do you say? Taking it out, redaction.
Revision, yeah.
Revision.
Does the second accept? Okay. All right. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? So we have recommended approval of the building code with the vent exception.
Mr. Chair, before you move on, I just want to make clear that is the revised version of your building code, because that is the one that includes the residential sprinkler provisions in the residence code.
It is, and it's the one, as the maker of the motion, it's the one that we were handed today as we came in with that change.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So moving on to the fire code. Staff presentation?
I should be able to be brief. As we discussed, these codes are on a 3-year cycle, and the building code is generally defined as the design code of the two. The fire code is the maintenance code. When the Building Standards Commission of the state looks at the fire code, they're allowed to look at elements of the fire code that apply to building standards. The problem with the fire code is there are certain chapters that don't apply to building standards, and as such, the state is hands-off. They don't adopt them or not adopt them, they don't address them. And what happens is that there are some elements of the International Fire Code, for instance, Chapter 3, which is described as general precautions against fire, is a very important chapter to us. The state doesn't adopt it, but we do, and with some changes, because it provides for a mechanism for us to go out and enforce general fire code requirements for maintenance of yards, for instance. I believe we addressed that a little bit earlier. So we do adopt certain things in the fire code that the state does not adopt, and they become part of our adopting ordinance. Likewise, there are certain chapters, for example, Chapter 4, which describes emergency procedures, that neither the state nor the city adopt, because there are other provisions in Title 19 through the Office of Emergency Services and others that address those types of elements more than the International Code does. So we don't adopt Chapter 4. But for the most part, in this adoption cycle, it was fairly straightforward for us because the state moved away from the Uniform Fire Code in the last adoption cycle, 2007. At that time, we made many amendments to what we viewed as a new code in the International Code, as did the state. In this iteration, most of what we did was imported the changes we made in the 2007 code into the current code with some minor revisions here and there. So what you're looking at in the adopting ordinance is for the most part existing. Again, some of the changes we had to make were in the sprinkler ordinance that we previously adopted. We had to separate the residential section and import it into the residential code while keeping the commercial section in Chapter 9 of both the building and the fire code. So now the sprinkler ordinance that you adopted under 5298 is split. And so we're proposing deleting that old ordinance and adopting it under this one in the two different codes, just to be in keeping with the way the state adopts it. In addition to that, we added a little bit of language to the wildland-urban interface sections. And one of the sentence that we added to 4907 of that code basically, we think, cleans up the language a little bit about defensible space and whether or not you're responsible for your vegetation on your property extending into somebody else's defensible space. We just felt that it needed a little bit of clarification, so we added a sentence to that. Otherwise, the 4900 series, including the smoking one that we were discussing earlier, are the same sections that we had previously. And the ordinance as a whole has gone through some renumbering. For instance, 49 used to be 47, but mostly administrative issues. So in its current iteration, it's the code is primarily the same code that you looked at in 2007 with minor adjustments. And that's basically it. If you have any questions, I'm prepared to answer them.
Thank you. Any questions of Mr. Poirier?
No.
Mr. House? Okay. I didn't get your reference to 4907. What I'm looking at here talks about 8.04010 is one, and I'm just not understanding where 4907.
I show it on page 15 of mine.
The revised for
Okay, 4907. Okay, very good. Right. All right. Okay. Well, my question then deals with when we were talking about, and I mentioned this to you before the hearing. Could you please guide us on the issue of fire hazard, not just defensible space, but a fire hazard which affects neighboring properties? How is that addressed? And what I was getting in our brief conversation was it's not addressed in the material that's before us, but it's addressed somewhere else. Is that correct?
Correct. Actually, it's addressed indirectly in the material before you. I was talking a moment ago about Chapter 3 of the Fire Code. That's Chapter 3 of the International Code as it's written. We adopt sections of Chapter 3, precautions against fire, outright without changing them. And one of the sections that we adopt comes under the heading of vegetation, and it's section 304.1.2. And basically that says that anytime you have vegetation on your property that's a threat to another property or the area in general, that we can abate that problem. But then when it talks about defensible space, it specifically refers to Chapter 49 for defensible space issues.
So we don't have them in the material before us, this vegetation that's risking neighboring properties.
Correct. Only because we didn't bring the entire code. We brought the adopting ordinance that adopts that code.
Okay.
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Vincent.
if I can add a little clarification to how we're treating some of these chapters. Mr. Poirier is discussing Chapter 3 of the International Code. The International Code has a Chapter 3. It covers, amongst other topics, this issue of vegetation. Past iterations of the International Code did not treat it the way we wanted to treat it. In other words, particularly this definition of vegetation and what you have to do with hazardous vegetation. So when you look today at the current municipal code, there is a section that includes a definition of vegetation. And Mr. Poirier referenced the section 304.1.2. That is in our current code. Well, the International Fire Code saw the light. They basically adopted a definition that is what we want. And so this time around, you'll look on page 7 of your revised copy of the Fire Code that was handed out to you today, and you'll see that very section being deleted. That's because we don't need to have it in our own code anymore. It's found in the parent document now.
Okay.
And so that subject is covered in the parent document, in the International Fire Code, and we will be able to use that code for our enforcement purposes.
Okay, good.
So what you see on the page here is just simply the cleanup factor of showing you what is changing from the current code, and that's the reason why we're changing this time.
All right. Well, that is a critical piece of where the region needs to go in terms of improving our fire safety. So I just want to make sure that we have up front and out loud the ability to enforce people's managing their vegetation that is endangering their neighbors.
Correct. And we also have the Municipal Code 8.08, what we call the weed abatement ordinance.
Yeah.
And that applies to vacant land. So we apply different sections to different situations.
But this can developed land.
304 can
that's
define
overgrown,
anything,
and I'm hearing that we have it. That tool is in our bag already.
It is.
Okay, great. All right, moving back to 4903.1. The statement, and again, I have my notes in the stuff that was handed to, the homework we were given, so I'm going to stick with that rather than going to the material that I was handed today. There's mention of a fire protection plan shall be prepared for parcels within urban wildland interface areas when required by the fire code official. When is that?
This would usually be required when development is proposed, or expansion of a development is proposed, but also when there's a substantial fire hazard, we could apply this section. A good example that's not in our jurisdiction would be the Botanic Garden in Mission.
Well, that's not in our. That's.
But if we were to have a similar, let me use the example of Riviera Park. Let's say that they wanted to expand or do something different in their area. We may require a fire protection plan for something like that, so that we would have a good understanding of exactly what kind of hazards that they were going to create.
Okay. How about a new house in the high fire hazard area? Would that trigger a fire protection plan?
Generally not. A new single-family residence would not trigger a fire protection plan.
Okay. Well, I think it should. So that's something I'd like us to talk about momentarily. And then the other ingredient that, in looking at a plan, going on to the next section, content, what I'm not the information that I'm not getting out of that is the maintenance over time. One of obviously the problem here is that if you have a one shot, and that's very different than building code where you build something well and then you just sort of you hope that it's going to last a long time. Whereas when you make a place fire safe, immediately the elements, the wonders of plant growth start to increase the hazard. And so how can we develop some sort of, it would seem to me a good idea to have the ability to have good maintenance over time as part of that fire safety.
Immediately is a good way to put it, especially in weather like this. The vegetation is a constant, ongoing issue for the fire department. And as you know, defensible space, vegetation management on open parcels is something that we're addressing on a year-in, year-out basis. But it is a matter of responsibility on the part of the parcel owner, the property owner, and it's something that for a large part of our job is complaint-driven. Inspectors have spent, in the last 20 months, over 1,000 hours on enforcement of parcels. We do a lot of public education outreach. We send out our high fire pamphlets and letters every year to all residents in the 4,000 parcels in our high fire areas. And we do get generally good cooperation. But in order to even spend one enforcement case on one parcel, it is a time-consuming process, and we do constantly remind the public and homeowners, particularly in that area, that the more they do without our encouragement, the less time we have to spend on enforcement cases.
Well, I certainly sympathize that we're undergunned in the area of enforcement, and it's just something that we're. The problem is it's our biggest regional safety problem is wildfire, and it's clearly in the last few years we've experienced the pain of that, and that's why I'm looking for places and to do better with that. And I submit that having a fire protection plan for a new residence is a reasonable task, and it's one that I know that when I was on the Planning Commission, I argued for, and I think successfully got in some situations, landscape plans which reflected improved fire safety when a subdivision occurred. But is that something I'd ask our council, is that something that we feasibly can consider at this point?
Well, Mr. Chair, I think I'd actually ask Mr. Poirier to distinguish between a fire-safe landscape plan and a fire protection plan. And I believe those are two different things. And so what the chair may be discussing is a landscape plan that is reviewed by the fire code official for purposes of fire safety. And that actually is on page 17 of your revised copy of the fire code, section 4907.7.1, new development, states that new developments in the wildland urban interface area must submit landscape plans for review by the fire code official. So there's a,
if I may, on my page 17, you're using the new page 17, I guess.
Yes, please.
Mr. Chair, and if I misunderstood that, the vegetation plan, the landscape plan is required, period.
Good.
Throughout.
Right.
Joe, if you could make explain to the committee the distinction between a fire protection plan as you were describing for, say, the Riviera Center versus a landscape plan.
A fire protection plan is an overall comprehensive approach to how an entity is going to find itself in the wildland area. For instance, it would delineate maybe extra hydrants, but not only extra hydrants, but where are the hydrants? Maybe exterior sprinklers would be required. There are a lot of elements that could go into that type of a plan. What the staff is supposed to do when an event occurs, for instance.
I'm okay with that. I mean, having worked on Marymount and Riviera Park.
And you're familiar with El Encanto as well.
El Encanto as well. So I get where you're going with that, and I'm not so concerned about that. I mean, I'm delighted that I think that good effort is going into that now. So I'm not worried about that going forward. And I appreciate that the landscape plan, I hadn't caught that is part of what is now for a new single-family residence, a landscape plan dealing with fire safety is on the books already.
And I'm sorry, I misunderstood that, but yes, it is required, and our wildland specialist has to approve it before the house can be occupied.
Great. I like that. Okay, I just want to make sure that everything I have here. The rest of my comments are wordsmithing that are not worth. I think that we've got the intent here, so I'm good at this point. So, any other questions at this point, Mr. House? Now,
Yes, we're I think pretty much getting there. And I really appreciate what we just talked about. And now that I see those two sections, the high fire hazard area fire safe landscaping report of all parcels and the new development in the wildland urban interface area landscape plans that are required, I think they go heartily to what you're talking about. And one of the when we talk about wildland urban interface areas, that was the earlier question that was asked, and you defined those areas. But I seem to remember that the Mesa has areas that have similar characteristics. Could we include them in that definition as well?
Yes, we do. And the defensible space requirements are a little less stringent and so forth, but the Mesa area would be considered our coastal interior zone, which is a high fire area.
Great, thank you. And then to that point about, without Mr. Vincent's explanation about us removing that section of vegetation, which we're really now, it's cleanup because it's already in the International Fire Code. If someone's coming forward with development or any proposal or anything really that would touch on this, how will they know to read, to look at the International Fire Code to find out what the city of Santa Barbara is holding them to.
On a long-term maintenance or on a design?
Well, we're by reference adopting, once again, the International Fire Code with some amendments, right, on this 3-year cycle. So after this hearing, or even the city council, when we may or may not even get to that point of discussion, how would anybody in the public know that?
If you were proposing to build something, for instance, in a high fire area, fire inspectors are required to review the set of plans as they are routed through community development, as you know. And when we look at the construction, for instance, they have to meet the requirements of 7A of the new residential code. We look at the landscaping and so forth. We also are required to go out and do site visits to verify that the building and the grounds are in the shape that that they were proposed and that we required. At those times, we usually educate the homeowner or the business owner about what's going to be required to maintain those elements, and that's generally when we acquaint them with.
That's part of what we call the DART process, design and review team.
Correct.
That process.
All the way through the plan check and review and site inspection process.
Okay.
But it would start in the DART process. Yeah,
Seems like public education really is going to continue to be an incredibly important part of this, because it would be so esoteric otherwise. It would, even for like the maintenance, as was mentioned earlier, how important maintenance and upkeep is. If we're really referencing these codes, there needs to be some way to keep bringing it to light in the community.
It's key, and that's why we send out these brochures every year and letters to all the homeowners and all the property owners. We also have the element of people who simply buy homes in the area and are unaware because they've never lived in a high fire area before.
Okay.
And those people have to be re-educated or educated from scratch every year.
All right, well, thank you. Mr. Chair, would you entertain a motion? Would it be all right?
I would.
Okay, then I move that the Ordinance Committee recommend for approval to the City Council the fire ordinance that we have here with and all the amendments that we have in front of us.
We have a motion and second for a recommendation of approval to be sent to council on the fire code. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay, the motion passes. And there being no other business to come before